Can everybody see that? Great. So my name is Patrick Schmidt, as Shivani mentioned. I'm a consultant working mostly with organizations in the community doing research computing and data stuff. I've been retired. I'm retired from UC Berkeley, where I spent about a dozen years in a role leading research IT and the research computing program there. Before that, I spent a lot of years in private industry, a couple of years as a researcher in various different institutes, Microsoft Research, and then the Dutch Software Research Institute and Yahoo Research doing multimedia stuff. So I've kind of been around and done different things. The last 15 years or so, I've been focusing mostly on research technology support. So some people call it research cyber infrastructure, some people call it CI, some people call it research IT. In a community that I'm in, it's often referred to as research computing and data. So if you hear me use these various terms, they're all kind of interchangeable in our world. So what I really want to talk about today is I understand many of you are in the data science program or related programs or in some research domains. So I want to talk about some of these potential career paths that you may or may not know about and possibly intrigue you to think about doing that as one of your options. So one of the things we talk about in the community, especially folks that are involved in these programs and are trying to hire, we hear all the time when we're trying to hire somebody, or even when we advertise a position, folks say, I had no idea these jobs even existed. And so that's really what I want to tell you about these, the need for folks who can do this kind of work, how the folks who are in these jobs think about them and move through this kind of career, and how you can learn more about whether this might be a good fit for you. So the first thing I want to do is borrow some slides from a panel that was hosted by one of the groups I work with at a conference called PERC, Practice and Experience in Advanced Research Computing, which has been going for quite a few years now. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a conference for professionals working in research computing and data. So about 6 years ago, we had this panel, and a guy, Stuart Geiger, who is a social science researcher, who's now at UC San Diego, then was at Berkeley Institute of Data Science, very much like the Hawaii Data Science Institute. And he and a working group there were doing some research to understand the human side of academic data science. And so I'm just borrowing a couple of his slides because they did some really interesting work, and this is going back quite a ways. So one of the things they noticed that, and they characterized modes of working for folks who are doing this and roles in this. So the modes were often individual, like doing consulting or research engagement, instruction, not surprisingly, whether it was short workshops or traditional courses. And then integration, working long-term or alongside labs or departments or projects and things like that, maybe bought in a grant. And then also infrastructure, so folks that are actually building and maintaining the resources that researchers use. And the roles that then were associated with these are teaching, onboarding, or sometimes called research engagement or research facilitation, infrastructure maintenance, obviously, but then also data and workflow management, assisting or doing directly, and sometimes bespoke software development or bespoke data manipulation kinds of things that were maybe on researchers or in labs or things like that. One of the things, the clear signals that came out of their research was the need for an alternative to the faculty route, but that was still in academia. There's a lot of people who really wanted to continue to do research, but either they didn't feel that this, like, as they characterized it, tenure wasn't worth it, or they just thought, chasing money and managing grad students all the time doesn't sound as much fun as doing research. And I've known several folks who felt this way and ended up, there was a guy that I knew that was actually being actively recruited during his PhD, and he decided he'd rather actually work in support of research than becoming a faculty member. So some years ago, there were several NSF, National Science Foundation workshops that were exploring challenges in supporting what they call research cyber infrastructure, which is, again, what we call RCD, or research computing and data. And they found that the research computing and data profession had a number of challenges. In particular, there was a critical shortage of the RCD workforce. There's just not enough people to fill the needs of research computing and data profession to support the advanced research that depends upon this key workforce. There's so much technology coming down the pipe. Research is dependent on it so much. many researchers don't know how to take full advantage of that, and they need the support of technology professionals who understand research. There are a host of recruitment challenges. For one thing, it was hard to recruit people into it and know how to market it, because people didn't know how to pitch them, and they didn't know where to pitch them, which is why you may not have heard about a lot of these things. They had seen at the time, these were back in the mid 2010s, I think, that there were retention challenges, partly because of a lack of well-defined career paths, although this has gotten better since those workshops and since the community has grown and matured, and I'll talk about those career paths a little more in a minute. For many potential candidates, they didn't know anybody who did it, and so they didn't have a role model. They didn't know what a successful career in RCD looked like, and in particular, these positions were sometimes confused, especially by universities. They were confused with enterprise IT, which has some overlap, certainly. There's a lot, people who work on storage may understand a lot of the same concepts. But the thing is that where administrative and enterprise IT is focused very much on stability and high service availability, research needs often are much more about getting the most performance with the latest technology possible. And research engagement is often a much more high touch thing, where enterprise IT is trying to optimize their services, and that generally means minimizing research support. So these were some of the issues that had been identified in the past. So the community has been doing a lot of work. Like, when I say the community, I mean organizations that I participate in, and many of the people who are currently doing these jobs. They've been doing a lot of work to grapple with these challenges. So this timeline is kind of an eye chart, but it shows a bunch of the things that have been going on over time, including workshops and meetings to understand these challenges. We began to develop some simple taxonomies to describe different roles within the profession. There was a group that developed a whole job family and job descriptions and titles to help universities understand how to appropriately classify these kinds of people. And then we've done a lot of work surveying and interviewing existing professionals so that we can characterize everything from our demographics to the motivations and the factors that actually influenced career decisions, so we know what these careers could look like. This has produced a host of good publications, as well as some ongoing working groups to advance the profession and to help new folks understand the opportunities and grow into these careers. So one of the clear needs that emerged was a way of describing the different aspects of the work that these folks do. So we came up with a model that we call facings, which just describe the main focus of these different roles. And so I should note, a lot of people wear several hats. And so these are roles rather than distinct job titles. Now, there are some places where somebody might be almost entirely, for example, systems facing. They may just work on systems and storage or something like that, or they may be focused very much as a network engineer. So there's some people who have just one of these. In research IT, research computing and data, we see a lot of people who have multiple ones. So you may be researcher facing, doing user support or facilitation. You may also be doing data management stuff, or possibly even helping them with some software. Strategy and policy facing is sort of how we call the people who are in leadership. And those folks often are also out there working with researchers. So you'll hear us talk about these facings a fair amount. They're really just roles or ways of chunking up sort of how we think about the different aspects of our work. So here I'm borrowing from another really good talk that was given by some colleagues who conducted a survey of the community, and they were just understanding the demographics of it. So I want to share a couple of points, but you can find the paper if you want to learn more. It's up there, and we'll make the slides available later if you want to get some of these links and things. You don't have to worry about grabbing them now. About 70% of the respondents did have a graduate degree, but you'll note that a lot of them don't have a PhD. For a while, there was this idea that you had to have a PhD to understand research, but we find that a lot of them don't. And it's not surprising that a lot of them do have some graduate degree, because academic institutions place a lot of value on these academic credentials and degrees, but it's also that we want people to have both the technical skills that are needed to help people use this technology, but also some understanding of what the research workflow is like. And so the degree requirements for these jobs don't always align with position responsibilities. And we've been trying to educate hiring folks around this to get away from looking at degrees and more looking at background and experience and things like that. So don't let if you're not going after a PhD, don't let that discourage you from thinking about this as a career. One of the things I also wanted to highlight that came out of their study, which I thought was interesting, was the level of satisfaction. Asking people, how satisfied are you working in the RCD field? And you'll see people really love these jobs. Almost half of them are extremely satisfied, and the vast majority of them are at least pretty satisfied with the jobs. And if you talk to folks across many, many domains, you'll see this is pretty remarkable in terms of kinds of jobs to have that level of satisfaction. So another set of colleagues and I wanted to more deeply understand the career paths of RCD professionals. Our research borrowed concepts from organizational studies, including the idea of organizational socialization. And this slide shows that methodology, but what I really want to focus on here were the research goals. So we wanted to help recruiters to market these positions. We wanted to help hiring managers retain their workforce. We wanted to highlight possibilities for the potential future workforce, which might be you all. And then we wanted to highlight future paths and possibilities for growing in a career of the existing workforce. And I think, as I talk about some of these things, it'll give you a sense sort of who's in this and doing this, what motivates them, but also, okay, if you decided to do this, what would it look like to have a career in this? So our first step was to conduct a second survey that explored what we call the factors influencing RCD professional career decisions. And this is a survey of existing professionals, but it should give you a sense of these folks and what their motivations are, as I was just saying. So we also gathered some demographics, just so we understood who we were talking to in our survey, including the individual's major field of study, which you see here. And while many of them did study engineering and physical sciences, which you might expect in terms of a fairly technical role, quite a few of them came from other domains as well, as you can see here. The other thing that I will just note really quickly, when we looked at the gender distribution of folks that we surveyed, and we think it's reasonably representative of the broader population, but a little over a third of them were women, almost 60% identified as male, and then there was another 4% who were gender nonconforming or gender queer, and about 3% who said they didn't want to respond to that question. So it's not, even though it's involved in technology, it's not nearly as male dominated as some tech fields are. And one of the things that I joke about is, or I've heard women in the community joke about, is at PERC, the conference that I mentioned earlier, which is this conference of our domain. It's one of the few technology conferences where there's a line for the women's bathroom, because there are actually quite a few women represented in our community. And I think that's a really funny way of measuring it, but it's a reality that it's a lot of women say this is one of the most welcoming areas of technology that they've encountered. So another question we asked was how people make career decisions over the course of their career. So we wanted to cluster them into career stages. And this graph just shows that when we were talking to people, we had a pretty representative mix of folks who had just started out, who were early in their career, some who were at the midpoint in their career, and then others that were advanced. We basically bucketed them into three equal groups. So when we're talking about some of the things that I mentioned as factors, you see sometimes we did see a difference between early career and later career folks. If you're just thinking about joining this, you'll see this. But a lot of the things that we saw actually were common across all these things. And you'll also see that here, people could say which area they focused on. They could answer more than one, which is why these numbers add up. But you'll see that while we had a lot more late career folks in the leadership area and the systems facing area, it was a pretty balanced set across some of the other things in terms of what people did in their jobs. So we also asked, how important were the following factors in your successfully pursuing RCD opportunities? How did you go? What were the things you thought were important in getting a job? And we let them rank 17 factors that ranged from demographics to skills and capabilities. Now, here, the top two are probably likely to be expected, that they had to have some technical skills and they had to have experience in academic research. But we thought it was interesting that a lot of folks ranked interpersonal communication as a really high, really important thing. And a lot of that probably is because you're a lot of the job is working with people and helping researchers. So the next set ranged from training and experience to getting a good referral from somebody. But the bottom of that set is leadership skills, which I thought was interesting. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Among the least important things were technical certifications. In particular, in areas like software-facing, people just didn't think that that was that valuable. And I think that varies a little bit depending upon domain and geography and institutions. But that was interesting. And people in general didn't believe that age, gender, or racial identity mattered all that much in getting jobs. Now, in all fairness, about half of the people that we interviewed were white men, and so they never see that as a big issue. But still, broadly speaking, a lot of the respondents didn't think that was a big deal. We also wanted to know, this is another one that may be a little bit hard to read everything. We wanted to know what people wanted out of these careers. And so what question we asked was, what does advancement in your current RCD role mean to you? We didn't necessarily say promotion, but just advancing and becoming more experienced and having a bigger role. And we would note that factors related to leadership, like having influence and making an impact, are rated quite high, even though people said they didn't think they were that important in getting a job in the previous slide. So there's an interesting contrast between the factors that are related to leadership, which are rated high, and the factors that are more in the domain of management, which are rated quite low. So what's interesting is a lot of people really wanted to have more of an impact, have more influence. Basically, they wanted to do something really cool and feel like it was important. But you didn't have a lot of people who loved the idea of managing, which is another thing that I think is interesting. And so we actually followed up on that a fair amount, talking further with people about what an advanced career looks like if you're not a manager. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So this is, I think, another distinction somewhat between the research-related roles and traditional IT roles, reflecting a culture of research organizations that tend to be less structured and hierarchical than enterprise IT orgs. So you might even have a research IT org where somebody's the lead, but it's a little more chill. Management isn't as big a piece of what they do. So I think that's kind of an interesting aspect of these jobs. So we also asked, how important were the following factors in motivating you to make a previous job transition, or that would make you consider a move in the future to or within the research computing field, that is, to a new RCD position or role? And there's an interesting contrast between seeing higher salary as one of the highest signs of advancement and the much lower ranking of salary when shifting from one job to another. So again, they wanted to, the most important things were an opportunity to have a more meaningful contribution, develop their skills, or joining an organization that embraces innovation. They wanted to work someplace really cool that was doing cool stuff. They did definitely say that having a work-life balance was important, having a higher salary, a promotion was nice, and the opportunity for influence. So it's not that those things aren't important by any means. It's just that people actually ranked these other sort of mission-related things higher than some of those purely external motivators. And then somewhat important was relocation. This was something where I think there was a mixed bag. For some people, being able to stay where they are was really important, and for other people, they were willing to move to get a really good job, but it wasn't that big a deal to them. So we thought it was interesting that that there's that sort of disconnect between it's a sign of advancement to get more money, but they don't actually care about it nearly as much as some of these other factors. So what I wanted to do with this is just give you some idea of the kind of people and their motivations who are in these roles. And really what it boils down to is they love the work, the mission of the organization, often an academic institution or a public institution, or whether it's a state agency or something like that. But they really want to be connected to the work that they're doing, their teams, and they really want to grow as professionals. So after we completed all this survey-based research, we also conducted a series of in-depth interviews. We analyzed the results, and we published both a white paper as well as a visualization in the form of a transit map. So This is a bit of an eye chart. It was designed to be a large poster. So what I want to do is, but the idea was we wanted to look kind of like a transit system map so that people could see, where you come in, where you transfer, and so forth. So I'm going to look at some of the highlights here. So this is a close up a little bit of the main part of the transit map. And in the main part of the map, we described a couple of the things we found. So one of them was that people come from a host of different backgrounds and intellectual domains, which underscored what our earlier survey had found, but it's not just that you come from technical stuff or from a PhD program. There's a need for a lot of different kinds of roles in these things, although it's still what draws people to them is the nature of the work and the connection to the research typically. Another key point, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is that you don't necessarily have to go into management to advance your career. So on this chart, basically time is, or the length of your career is going from left to right. So you come in and enter, and one of the early decisions tends to be, first, do you want to go into a more technical, and actually I misspoke earlier, this is not about management. This here is whether you want to focus more on developing a lot of technical and organizational expertise. So it may be that you want to focus on being a storage person or being an expert in cloud computing or being an expert in high performance computing or things like that. Or other people really are more focused on knowing everything that's needed for a given domain. So they might be the person who knows everything about what's needed for computational chemistry or everything that's needed for digital humanities or something like that. So that was often sort of early decision, although the little dots that cross over all the time indicate that people do transition back and forth. The next big decision point was whether they want to manage or not. And here the point is that you can become a technical expert, you can become a domain expert, or you can also go into leadership if that's something that you really like. But the point is there's a lot of different ways you can pursue these careers, and you have a lot of different options, and that's what we're trying to capture. Some of the other features on this, you'll see the blue stripe along the bottom. We show this because many research software engineers are somewhat more embedded in their research groups than some of the other roles, like researcher facilitation or data roles, where you might be embedded in a project, but often you're somewhat more of a generalist and you can help a lot of different projects, whereas research software engineers often are embedded in a given project for a long time. So they sort of straddle between research and the traditional career bands here. A few of the other things that we show here is that people do transition in and out of academia. Some folks early on decide that they want to go either into enterprise IT, maybe because that's what they knew about and that's what they found out about, or those jobs are available, or they might go into industry in some form. They go work for a software company, or they go work for a big company doing data work or other kinds of things. But people also come back. We used to joke about folks coming in from the cold. We had when I was at Berkeley, we could never compete in terms of salary with Silicon Valley jobs. If you really wanted to make a lot of money, you would go out to one of the big companies and you could make a lot more. But people often burned out on the nature of the work and what they felt was the impact of their work. And so we had people who were mid-career who would come back to the university because they're willing to take a pay cut because they just wanted to do something that they were more excited about and they felt was a better use of their time and energy. And so you see all these little connection points, kind of like transfer points on a transit system map. And what they're trying to convey there is that people do move in and out and they move across different things over the course of their career. I was one of those people. I spent 20 odd years doing startups in Silicon Valley. I decided I really wanted to go back to school and went back to get a master's focusing on, originally I was going to do artificial intelligence for museums. It was something I'd been doing on my own in research, and ended up getting hired by the university and getting involved in the research IT world. So I'm one of those people who was out in industry and then came back. So we also noted a couple of common things that emerged from the study participants. there was 3 typical decision points, and I talked a little bit about these already, although they don't necessarily happen in this sequence. They're just 3 different ones we noted. One of them was academia or industry, and the main things that people thought about were how important is mission to you, how important is salary, and in some cases, do you have a choice about where you want to live? Another typical decision point was enterprise IT or research IT. Some people really love the rigor and sort of stability of an enterprise IT kind of role. If they're a technologist, maybe they're a systems person who likes being in with the machines, and they don't really want to spend a lot of time dealing with other people who aren't technologists. And so there, some of the factors were really, are you aware of the options in research IT, but also, have you had any exposure to research? And one of the things we found is a lot of the people who ended up in research IT or research computing and data things, they were really curious, both about technology, but also just about stuff. They liked working with people who were doing interesting things. And they liked engaging with people. They really liked being a translator for the researchers to help them understand what technology could actually advance their research and how they could use that. And then obviously the management role one that I mentioned. And the key things there really were, do you like to manage and coach? Do you kind of have a strategic orientation where you like to plan and figure stuff out? Did you have a mentor who encouraged you? This was a big factor. And so, something that I'll mention again in the next slide is the importance of finding and working with mentors. But the other factor in there that I do think is important, a lot of people mentioned that there's a lot of luck and opportunity in advancing into management. You have to be in the right place at the right time, and an opportunity comes along or somebody makes you aware of an opportunity to go after it. And I don't think we often acknowledge how often luck has a big factor in our lives and in our careers. And part of that is that when an opportunity comes along, are you ready to jump at it? But it's a real thing. And some people who are really great just don't end up happening to have the same opportunities. And it's one of those things. Doesn't mean they're not happy. Doesn't mean they don't do something really cool. But they may not rise up and to be a senior leader just because the organization didn't have opportunities that way. So the last thing in the transit map, which is at the bottom of that viz, we distilled some common patterns and themes from the interviews, and we grouped them into characteristics of the roles, the factors and influences on their career decisions, and the main motivations we saw for people in that kind of work. And we noted these patterns across the 3 career stages. Now, there's a lot here. You can go back and look at the slide later if you want. The thing that I would look at is in the early RCD career, the people who tend to go into this have a lot of learning. They value learning skills. They're curious. They tend to be kind of self-starters. They're somewhat risk tolerant. That is, they don't need a very stable job that's not high on their list. Doesn't mean they don't value some amount of stability, but they're willing to take a few risks and try stuff and go after things. And they like community. They typically will have local influence. That last bit of influence is sort of how the characteristics change over time. Obviously, in early, you have local influence. Later on, you'll have regional, and in your late career, you might have national influence in terms of your ideas and your ability to have an impact. So the factors and influences, a big one was role models, having somebody that you could talk to who is doing something like this. Exposure to both technology and research. That was a big thing. People who had found out about these jobs and who had some exposure to research knew that for them, at least, it was really cool. Many of them had either an internship or a postdoc that introduced them to this, and that's how they ended up getting into it. And then the key motivations, a couple of these things I've mentioned before, they love the academic mission. They really want to be connected to something that they think is making the world a better place. They have a service and team orientation. So where a researcher might really want to pursue the ideas, somebody who's in research, computing, and data likes actually providing services. They like being a support person. They like helping others to do their best. And in many cases, what we heard from them is also they were in a PhD program and they became disillusioned with the faculty track, which isn't to say that that's not a great option for some people, but it's not the right option for everyone. So you'll see a bunch of these other things. As I say, we can go back to those slides. And if you want, I can bring that back up later. But I want to talk a little bit now about If you are interested in these careers, what can you do to explore them? So if any of this has intrigued you, you may be asking yourself, so how do I get into this? How do I find more out about this? So the first thing I would say is there is lots of community. The first one listed up there is one that I do a lot of work with, the Campus Research Computing Consortium, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. EDUCAUSE has a research computing and data community group. They tend to also connect more to the enterprise side, which is really great. In many smaller institutions, you don't have a separate RCD group. People are doing both enterprise IT and research IT. There's also the US Research Software Engineer Association. If you are doing mostly research software, that's a great organization to be part of if you don't know about it already. It grew out of another one that was in the UK, but the research software engineers are a really great community for folks doing that kind of work. And then if you're more on the data side, especially if you have a connection to libraries, the Research Data Access and Preservation Group is a really good one. Again, I'll share these slides though, and you'll be able to get all the links. There's also a lot of training resources available to you. There's a great one. Some of you may have heard about the virtual residency in research facilitation. So Henry Neiman, who is just a force of nature in our community at Oklahoma University, runs this thing every year. He's been doing it for, at least 10 years or more. And it's a really, really cool online workshop, basically, or a short residency where you learn all about the different aspects of what's involved in these roles. And if you are interested, it's a great opportunity. It tends to fill up. He does it at least once or twice a year, and it fills up, and people really love it, and you build community through it as well. So people build ties to others around the country. The carpentries, obviously, software carpentry, data carpentry. Many of you may have heard of some of those. Those are really good resources. If you're really interested in high performance computing and cluster computing technology, the Linux Clusters Institute is a really good place to learn stuff. There's another link that it's at the bottom. There's this Airtable that Tim Middlecoop at Internet 2 has been maintaining that sort of lays out the entire landscape of organizations and things going on in the community. And you can sort and filter it depending upon your areas of interest and where you are in your career. It's a great resource. And I've got a link to that one there. So I mentioned CaRC. This is the Campus Research Computing Consortium. And so who are they? It's a community-led organization of professionals who deliver RCD resources. It was originally funded and supported by the NSF. It's now becoming an independent community. This is also where the professional surveys and career path research that I mentioned were mostly done. It supports everything from gathering the community together to advocacy for the profession, as well as developing a lot of tools, data, and resources for folks in this community. It's a grassroots organization that's grown rapidly in the 9 or 10 years since it began, and now it's fairly mature. We're currently pursuing becoming a 501c3 nonprofit. We just formed our first transitional board. We have something like, I think I heard 2,400 members now. It's still growing really fast from about 400 different institutions and hundreds of active volunteers from universities and organizations across the country. So why might you want to get involved in, or at least find out more about this? It's a really great place to meet others who share these professional interests and who are facing some of the same questions and challenges or interests as you. You can build a strong professional network really quickly. If you're looking for leadership opportunities, CaRC's got a lot of them. It's also just a lot of fun. It's a really, really nice group. People joke there's a lot of laughter, camaraderie, and joy that happens at these CaRC events. This is another eye chart. It's a visualization of everything going on. Don't worry about getting all the details, but the point is there's a lot going on at CaRC. One of the biggest things is a year-round virtual conference that has presentations and discussions related to different aspects of our work. Good place to learn and meet people as well. If you want to work on something in particular, you have a particular challenge you're facing, or you're trying to figure something out, there's a number of interest in working groups there that are working on very specific things like research cybersecurity or AI facilitation. That's a hot new one that's going on. There's a lot of activity going there. If you're trying to help people to figure out how to use AI in their research, that's a great group. If you happen to love infrastructure, organization, or community engagement, you can also volunteer to contribute to one of these, what we call operations groups. So they're just groups that keep us running and organized. And there's, it's just a lot of infrastructure stuff there, but it basically helps the community keep going. So that is the end of my prepared talk and slides.